You know, creating virtual machines is really easy, and we've seen exactly how easy it is in the previous videos in this series. But that said, we haven't really even touched the surface with what other options we have with our virtual machines though. There's a lot more to these virtual machines than where we've gone so far. So in this video, we're going to take a closer look at the options we have when configuring our virtual machines, and these options will be affecting each virtual machine individually. Things like how you can add more memory to a virtual machine, how you can add a hard disk or insert a CD, things that you would do to a normal physical machine. Then we've got our Hyper-V settings, the settings that'll affect all of your virtual machines, global settings like where your virtual machines are going to be stored, how networking is handled, and so forth. So on my own Hyper-V server here, let's start by having a look at the properties of a virtual machine first, and then we're going to move on and we'll take a look at the Hyper-V server's properties as well. Now when you have a real physical machine, it's likely that there's going to be times where you're going to want to have to upgrade that machine. You might need to put more RAM into it, maybe you want to add a new hard drive to it. Well, a virtual machine is really no different to a physical one in that sense, since the first thing you want to do when you want to change the settings of the virtual machine itself, or the virtual hardware if you prefer that term, is to shut down the virtual machine first, just like you would for most real physical servers. So since you can see our Windows 2008 virtual machine here that we built in a previous video is actually on right now, we're not able to edit a lot of the properties of this machine. So if we were to stop this machine from running right now, we'd then be able to make a lot more changes to it. For example, adding or reducing the amount of RAM that this virtual machine has can only be done when the virtual machine itself isn't running. So for us to do that to this machine, we'd have to shut it down first. But before we go and shut this virtual machine down though, and take a look at the settings, let's run through the menu system for this machine now, as there's some additional options you'll want to be aware of first. So on our File menu here, if we want to edit any of the properties of this virtual machine, we're going to choose Settings. But we'll come back to that in a moment, since this is where the bulk of the configuration will be done for this virtual machine. So moving along, the next menu item we have is the Action menu, which gives us some of the same options we have in our Hyper-V console. We can issue a Control-Alt-Delete, which is what we'll do to send the Control-Alt-Delete keystrokes to our virtual machine, and we've seen that before. We can turn it off, which is the same as pulling out the power cable on a physical machine. There's no graceful shutdown that way, it just pulls the power out, so our shutdown is going to occur straight away. But just realize that with this option, data corruption could potentially occur just like with a real physical machine. So personally, I only use this option if a virtual machine isn't responding or it's crashed, or I just don't need it anymore and I want to blow it away. Next, we can shut down the virtual machine as well, and this option works with more recent versions of Windows, and it actually sends a shutdown command to it, so it will attempt to shut down the virtual machine the graceful way. So it's just like clicking on Start and then shut down on a real Windows box. Now we can save the virtual machine, and we saw that in the previous video. This is going to save our virtual machine exactly the way it is right now, and it's going to turn it off after it's been saved. So let's try that again. We'll click Save. Down the bottom here we can see the progress bar, and it's currently ghosting out the virtual machine, so we can't use it right now. And once it's saved, which is pretty quick, it's been shut down. So to fire it back up, we'll just click on the power button, and that's going to turn it back on. And as you can see, it's pretty quick to save and resume. So understand that when we choose to save a virtual machine, it's just like using a sleep function, if you like, on a laptop computer. It's suspending the virtual machine right at that moment in time. But it does mean that if you choose to save your virtual machine, you still aren't going to be able to go out and edit a lot of the settings of that virtual machine, you know, add RAM, subtract RAM, add new hard drives and so forth. We'll still need to shut the machine down completely for that. So why would you want to save a virtual machine anyway? Well, there's plenty of reasons why you might want to save a virtual machine. Maybe you need system resources temporarily. For example, let's say this is a lab box here and I'm building a bunch of machines and I'm out of RAM. Well, I could save this machine where it is right now and free up those resources that this machine's using. Remember, it saves the machine in its current state, so if I had an application open and maybe a couple of documents, it's going to keep that stuff alive and open. Now, if I shut the machine down in the normal sense, then those applications and files would also be shut down. So saving is a good idea since you can continue with the machine exactly where you left off. Now, perhaps another reason for saving a virtual machine, maybe your machine is being attacked. And suspending it right now without just powering it off is one way of temporarily removing it from the network. In fact, if that was the case, really, your computer was being attacked, perhaps a better option would be to use the pause feature and pause the virtual machine, as this doesn't actually shut the machine down at all. It just takes it offline until you resume the machine by either clicking the play icon in the toolbar or up here in the action menu. We'll get an option here. In fact, let me just pause this real quick. We can see that now we've got a resume icon here. But as you saw, our resume option actually only shows itself if the virtual machine is currently paused. Okay, well, back on our actions menu, we can also reset our virtual machine, which is just like pressing a hardware reset button on a normal physical computer. We could take a snapshot, and we're going to talk about snapshots in a later video, and these things are great. You'll love snapshots and how they work. We could also revert to a saved snapshot, and again, we're going to talk about that later on. And at the bottom, we could also insert our integration services setup disk, which we've seen in a previous video. So our next tab up here is the media tab, and this is where we can insert a CD or a DVD into our virtual machine or even a floppy disk. And both of these things here, both of these two options are going to bring up a very similar window. So let's take a look at the DVD option, since that's definitely going to be the most utilized one for most people. So we've got options here to eject a DVD, and we've got options to insert a disk and capture a physical disk on our physical server. Now, the difference between inserting a disk and capturing one is going to be whether you want to use ISO images as your DVD, or if it's going to be a real DVD that you're putting into a real DVD drive on the physical server itself. So when you want to use an ISO image, you'll choose to insert a disk, and let's just click that one, and then we'll want to browse to where we have our ISO files stored, and then simply click open. So let's just go to my C drive here, and I have a folder here called ISOs. We saw that in an earlier video. And there's all the ISO files I have on this server. So let's just select our Windows 2008 64-bit one, and we'll click open. And you will notice, in fact, let me just log in to this machine here, just where we left it. And you'll notice now that if I go into this machine, and let's just double click on our drive, you can see that that DVD, that ISO file, has been mounted inside our virtual machine, and we can just access it just like we would any normal DVD. However, if I didn't have an ISO, then what we could do is we could cancel all this. We'll go back to our menu option, and we'll select our DVD. We could choose then to capture a real DVD that's in one of the real physical drives in our server. Now, if you've got multiple DVD drives in your server, then you're going to see additional drives listed here, so you can capture the DVD that's in the real drive. Now, you'll also notice at the top here, since we mounted that Windows 2008 ISO image, we've got an option here to eject that DVD. Well, since there isn't a real DVD in the server, we won't be physically ejecting anything, since what we'll really be doing is just unmounting the ISO image. So as far as the virtual machine thinks though, we've just done the equivalent of pushing the eject button on the DVD drive. Our next menu here is the Clipboard menu, and here we've got the ability to type clipboard text, and that can be really helpful, as sometimes you're going to want to cut and paste text between your physical host and the virtual guest operating system. So let's see what I mean. Let's go to our host operating system here, and we'll open up Notepad. And let's just write some text in here. Let's just write, this is some text. And we're going to select that text. We'll right click and we'll choose copy. Now let's go inside our virtual machine here, and we'll open up a copy of Notepad again. And we'll right click here, and you'll notice that paste is grayed out. Now that's because these two machines, they're operating independently of each other, and of course they maintain their own clipboards. So to fix that, we can come up to the top here in our Clipboard menu and choose to type the clipboard text. And notice that the text we had on the host now appears in the guest. Now the other option we had up here in our Clipboard menu was to capture the screen, and if we go and select this option, and let's go back to our host here and we'll just type in MS Paint. And now if I do a Control V to paste that in, you'll notice here that we've just pasted in a screen capture of our virtual machine. Now I like that since it makes it really useful for creating documentation and instructions for other people, or just sending a simple screen grab to a third party for some help. And that's really easy. All right, well, our final option here, we'll just close this down, is the View menu. And we've got options here to make our virtual machine full screen. In fact, actually what it will do is make the application full screen, just like a full screen remote desktop session would look. And it's only going to fill out the entire screen. You'll notice I've got these black bars around the outside here. It's only going to fill out the entire screen if our virtual machine is set to a high enough resolution. But anyone that's used remote desktop before would be right at home here. Okay, our final option here on the View menu is to toggle our toolbar on or off. Okay, well that's the settings that relate to the currently running functionality of this virtual machine. But like we said earlier, what about when you want to change the physical hardware that this virtual machine thinks that it has? Well, for that, we'll first need to shut this virtual machine down. So, inside our virtual machine, we'll click Start, and we'll go and choose to shut it down, just like we would any regular machine. Okay, well our machine's shutting down. We'll just give that a small moment. There we go, it's off completely, so let's just close this window. And now if we go back to our Hyper-V console, and we'll right-click on our Windows 2008 virtual machine, and we'll choose Settings. Now it's here that we're able to see all of the hardware that makes up our virtual machine. And straight away, down this left-hand side here, you're going to notice these things that all appear to be hardware related. We've got network cards, BIOS, memory, processor, we've got hard drives, and all of the nice stuff that makes up a server, it's going to be found right here. Now, although this window starts right at the top with the Add Hardware option, I'm going to skip that right now. I'm going to come back to it later, and there is a reason why. So let's just move on to the second option, which is the BIOS. Now, those of you that are familiar with a computer BIOS would know that this is where you're going to set the boot priority for certain devices in your system. Firstly, though, we're able to set whether or not the numlock key on our keyboard will be turned on or off when we start up the virtual machine. Then, what order we'll boot our devices from. So our first device that we'll boot from will be a CD-ROM, so that's going to ensure that this virtual machine is going to try and boot from a CD or DVD or even an ISO file, which is really just a virtual CD or DVD anyway. So it's going to try and boot from one of those optical options first before trying a hard drive, a legacy network adapter, or a floppy disk. Now you can change these around if you like. It's probably not likely that you'll need to change any of these, but you can simply select them and then click on these arrows and then move them up and down to suit your own requirements. Okay, the next option we have on the left-hand side is memory, and we can choose an amount of memory that will allow this virtual machine to have from a minimum of 8 meg. Well, good luck with that. 8 meg to, well, this is basically saying 4 gig, but actually it's not 4 gig at all. It's actually only telling me that 4 gig here is the maximum I'm able to use on this machine, and that's because that's how much memory this Hyper-V server has installed, the physical machine. So that 4 gig it's telling me is my real physical RAM. So ignore the fact that it says 4 gig. It's going to tell you here that the maximum amount of RAM is whatever you have in your physical server. So if you've got 8 gig of RAM in your server, your settings window right here will say 8 gig and so on. Actually, the real value here was probably going to max out at about 64 gig of RAM per virtual machine. Now honestly, I can't prove that because I don't have a machine here with more than 64 gig of RAM in it. But the Microsoft facts are that the Hyper-V host can support a maximum of 1 terabyte of RAM, with virtual machines supporting up to 64 gig per machine. So I'd expect, based on what Microsoft are telling me, you're not going to see any more than 64 gig ever written here. But if you see 64 gig written there, then I'd imagine that you've got quite a beast of a machine. So next we've got our processor, and this defaults to one single processor for this virtual machine, and we can change that to more on the condition that our host has a CPU that supports more as well. For example, this machine that I'm on right now, my physical machine, is a dual-core machine. So I can assign up to 2 logical processors per virtual machine. Now I've also got another Hyper-V machine in the lab here running a quad-core Xeon, and that shows 1, 2, and 4 processors. So what you see here is again going to be dependent on what you have inside your real physical hardware. Now you'll note down here we're also able to provide more granular controls over our consumption of system resources, and that's really a pompous way of saying we can control how much grunt this virtual machine is allowed to use. So we've got a virtual machine reserve and a virtual machine limit. Now the first part, the virtual machine reserve, allows us to determine of the total system resources that are available, how much will we reserve for this virtual machine to use. So this is a percentage of the whole system. How much will we reserve just for this machine? The second section down here is where we're able to stipulate how much of the resources that have been reserved for virtual machine use are able to be used by this machine. So finally down the bottom, we've also got a relative weight field. Now this defaults to 100, and this field will determine how Hyper-V allocates system resources to this virtual machine when there's more than one virtual machine running. So since this defaults to 100, and all virtual machines will default to 100 by the way, it simply means that as it stands, no virtual machine will receive more CPU time than another. However, if I had 2 virtual machines running and I set one of them to 50 and the other to 100, then the one that has 100 is going to receive more CPU as it has a higher priority. Now the final checkbox we have here at the bottom to limit the processor functionality says limit processor functionality to run an older operating system such as Windows NT, presumably because we've all got these new fast CPUs with multiple cores and features that weren't available when Windows NT was around, and Windows NT may have some problems with certain new CPU features as I understand it. Alright, well moving on, over here you'll notice that we've got 2 IDE controllers here in our default configuration, IDE controller 0 and IDE controller 1. And on our first controller here, we've got our hard drive, and on our second controller, we've got our DVD drive. Now if we select either of the actual controllers themselves, 0 or 1, over here on the right side, we've got the ability to attach another hard drive or another DVD drive to this controller. So if you need more hard drives, for example, you can just add them in. Now obviously, I already have one hard drive right now, so let's take a look at that, and in a moment, we'll see how we can create and add in a second hard disk. Okay, so our hard disk here for our Windows 2008 machine has a file name of windows2008.vhd. And this is the actual hard disk for this virtual machine. It's just one single file that'll grow as we write data to the hard disk. So this hard disk is on controller 0 at location 0, and the file itself is stored on my C drive in the VM folder, Windows 2008, of course, with the hard disk file, also using the same name as the name of the machine, windows2008.vhd. Now from this window here, we can create a new hard disk if we want to replace this one. We could edit this existing hard disk, we could inspect it, which if we click that for the moment, you'll see the current size of our hard disk along with how big it's allowed to grow. Now finally, if we click the Browse button here, it's going to open up Windows Explorer to the path where our hard disks are located, and you can see that my hard disk here is around about 8 gigabytes in size. Alright, well let's cancel this right now and let's see how we can create a new hard disk. So let's say we need to add in another hard disk to this machine that we're building right now. So the first thing you're going to want to do is either create it directly from this window here, or you'll notice right up here in the Actions pane on the top right of our menu here, we've got an option here where we can create a new virtual hard disk there as well. Now technically though, this is probably the best place for creating the new hard disk, since you're going to want to attach that hard disk to a virtual machine most likely anyway, so from this window at least we can do all of that in the one go. So if we select our IDE controller 0 here, in the right we're going to choose a new hard drive, and then we'll click add, and this is going to add a hard disk here to our settings window. But notice now we've got two hard disks. We've got our Windows 2008.VHD and this one, of course, which is currently blank. So this new hard disk is going to sit on our controller 0, as you can see, but in location 1 this time. Or if you'd prefer to imagine a real physical computer, this one will be the second connector on the IDE cable, if you want to think of it that way. Okay, well the file name here is blank, so we could either click Browse and go to a new virtual hard disk that we've already created, or create a new one. So we'll click New, and this is going to start up the virtual hard disk wizard, and it's one of those wizards like we saw earlier in this series when we created our first virtual machine, whereby you could just click Finish at any time throughout the wizard just to simply accept all of the default settings. But we'll go through it all now, so let's click Next. We'll first need to decide if this is going to be a dynamically expanding disk, and that's what we have now. One that starts really small and then it grows as we use it. We could create a fixed size disk, so if you use this option and you decide to make the disk say 100 gigabytes, then it's going to actually take up 100 gig even though the file itself is pretty much empty. Now obviously using a fixed size disk can be beneficial when you want to pre-allocate all of the space for the disk. That way you won't actually run out of disk space for this machine, since you'll already have taken it all. Now the final type is a differencing disk, which is basically like a child of a parent disk, whereby you've got a master disk and a differencing disk which only saves the changes that have been made to the master. Differencing disks are good because they allow you to roll back changes made to a disk just before you totally screwed things up. And we're going to see in another video how a related feature of Hyper-V called snapshots is one of the greatest things around. So the most common type of disk is likely to be the first one though, so we're going to go with that, a dynamically expanding one, and we'll click Next. Now we'll need to give our disk file name a name, and we'll need to choose where we're going to store it. So I'm going to give this one a name of just we'll call it seconddrive.vhd, and I'll click Browse, and I'm going to put this disk in the same place as my virtual machines, which is simply in my VM folder. So I'm going to select that folder and we'll click Next. Now here we can choose the size for this disk, which defaults to our standard 127 gig, but we could make that larger or smaller as we require. Now obviously if we accept this top option, then what it's going to do is it's going to create a brand new blank hard disk which can expand up to 127 gig. The second option down here differs in that it will copy the contents of the physical drive in your computer if that's what you want. But in most cases you'll be sticking with the first option, so that's what we'll do. We'll select that, we'll click Next, we'll get a summary, and we'll click Finish. And our hard disk has now been created. Now obviously since we've just added a hard disk to this machine, we're going to need to treat it just like we would with a real physical machine. We'll still need to fire this copy of Windows 2008 up and configure the disk in Windows, and we'll need to do that here as well. Just because it's a virtual machine, it's still a Windows server. So we've just added in the hardware. How we choose to use that disk in Windows is up to us. Now of course, if you decide you don't need this hard disk anymore, you could simply click the Remove button down the bottom here and you could get rid of it. But let's leave it there though. Alright, well on our second IDE controller, number 1, we've got a DVD drive. And if we select our DVD drive, you can set the media, what you'd expect to find in that drive. Now, as you can see, we've currently got our Windows 2008 64-bit ISO file mounted, which we did a little while ago. We could choose None, which is the same as unmounting this ISO file, or we could choose to mount the actual physical DVD drive in our server if we prefer to do that. Okay, next we've got our network adapter. In my case, this is using our lab network, which we've set up. Now, the thing about network cards that you need to be aware of is this. We have two types of network cards. We've got a network adapter and a legacy network adapter. Now the difference is that the normal network adapter is simply called network adapter like you see here. But this one requires the integration services to be installed in order to use it. Now the other type, the legacy network adapter, is based on an older network card which is slower, but it's compatible with operating systems that aren't supported by the integration services utility. Plus, it allows you to pixie boot to the network. So if you were to install Linux in a virtual machine and you wanted to pixie boot to the network, you'd need to add in a legacy network adapter since it simply emulates an Intel PCI network card. So the moral of the story is this. If you're running a modern operating system like Windows 2008, Windows Vista, Windows 7, then go with the network adapter and only use the legacy network adapter for pixie booting and non-Windows systems, or very old Windows systems for that matter. Now your next question of course should be, but how can I add in a legacy network adapter? Well, that's right up the top here of course. We'll click on Add Hardware, and over here on the right you'll notice we can add in a SCSI controller, a normal network adapter, and of course a normal network adapter is the same as what we've already got, and we can add in a legacy network adapter. So we just select legacy network adapter, we'd click Add, and down here you can see there's our legacy network adapter, which is listed as not connected only because we haven't yet assigned it to a network adapter in our physical server. So from our drop down box here, we tell it which network adapter in our server we want to use. So I'd use the lab one here. And from here, we could quite happily install Linux on this machine if we wanted to do that, and then the network is going to work fine. Now, if that was the case, by the way, let's say my intention is I want to install Linux on this virtual machine, then what I would do is I would select the normal network adapter and I would choose to remove that one. Now, the other options we have here with our network adapters are to use a dynamic or a static MAC address. The default is to use the dynamic one. And although you probably shouldn't have any problems with that, having the ability to choose a static one could help you out in the unlikely scenario where you've got another virtual machine trying to use the same MAC address for its NIC card. Unlikely, but potentially could happen. Now next we could also enable virtual LAN identification or VLAN identification, and we could specify a VLAN ID as well. We could also configure the virtual COM ports to communicate with the physical host through a named pipe. And finally, we could tell our virtual floppy disk drive to use an image file or not to use anything. Alright, well, that's the hardware in our virtual machine, and as you've seen, it's pretty flexible. We can add and remove CPUs, memory, hard disk drives, network cards, pretty much anything you'd expect to see in a real machine. Now, at the bottom of the window here, we've got a few additional management options. Firstly, we can see here the name of the virtual machine, which we can change, and we've also got a notes section here where we're able to jot down some notes about this machine, and you might see this section being populated by some other applications like System Center Virtual Machine Manager, which we're going to talk about in later videos. Next is integration services, and if we're running a supported operating system inside this virtual machine, we're able to install these integration services, and these additional features here will then be made available to that virtual machine. So we'll be able to do that operating system shutdown, time synchronization between our host and our guest, data exchange, heartbeat, and snapshots. Now speaking of snapshots, our snapshot location will be inside this folder here, which will default to having the same folder as the name of this machine. Now when our Hyper-V, our physical Hyper-V server starts, we can choose what we want this virtual machine to do when it starts up. So we've got the option here of doing nothing. We could automatically start the machine if it was running when we shut down Hyper-V, or we could just make it so that our virtual machine always starts up when the host starts up, even if we'd switched it off previously. Now if you have a lot of virtual machines running on the same server and all of them try to start up at the same time, then potentially you might have a problem with these machines all competing for the same physical hardware resources. So you can introduce a startup delay here just to ensure that all of these virtual machines aren't competing with each other at once. Now right at the bottom, our final option here is to decide what we want to do when the physical Hyper-V server is shut down. So when we shut down our server, do we want to save the state of this virtual machine? Well, that's the default and it's probably a good choice. Do we just want to turn it off? Well, probably not. You probably don't want to just pull out the power on any of your servers to shut them down, and a virtual machine shouldn't be any different. Our final option is to just shut down the virtual machine. So I reckon we should just go with save. I reckon it's the best in my opinion. Okay, well, that's all of the settings that pertain to each virtual machine. And each virtual machine you create is going to have all of these settings the same. They're all going to have memory, CPU, hard disks, network cards, all those types of things, so you can customize them to each virtual machine as you like, just like you could if you were to build a whole bunch of real physical servers. However, there are more settings we need to talk about, and these ones relate to Hyper-V itself. So let's just click OK here, and in the Actions pane, we're going to choose Hyper-V settings. Now, the good news is with all of these settings is that they're pretty much self-explanatory. First of all, where do we want our virtual hard disks and virtual machines to be stored? Well, these are the default locations. You can change them if they like. Pretty much no-brainer stuff there. For the keyboard, when we use specific Windows keyboard combinations, such as when we Alt-Tab to cycle through open applications, do we want the physical host computer to respond to those keyboard commands? Or maybe just the virtual machine? Or only the virtual machine if it's currently running at full screen? Now, the reason why this is important is that if we were to set this to use the physical computer, and then we hit Alt-Tab on our keyboard, it's going to cycle through all the applications that are running on the physical computer. And the virtual machine's applications won't be cycled at all. So we can set the priority here to whatever machine we want to grab those specific keyboard combinations. Now, when we don't have the integration services installed, and we click our mouse inside a virtual machine, then that virtual machine is going to grab our mouse cursor, and it won't make it possible for us to take it outside of that virtual machine. It's going to lock our cursor inside the virtual machine. So to get it out of there, so you can still work on the host operating system, or maybe use a different virtual machine, you can press this keyboard combination of Control, Alt, and left arrow, or you can set it to one of these other options if you'd prefer. But by default, Control, Alt, and left arrow, it's something that you're going to want to remember. Now next, under User Credentials, we can choose if we want to use our credentials that we're currently logged on with to access virtual machines on this system, and that's the default. But if you don't have permission using your current account, then you will be prompted to enter in a username and password for an account that does. Now, delete saved credentials here allows us to delete any credentials that have been saved. So if I'd entered in a username and password to access a virtual machine, and then I'd chosen to save those credentials, this box here allows me to delete them for better security. Now, our final option here is to reset checkboxes, and that simply puts all of the various options back to the defaults. So if we make any changes to Hyper-V and we deviate from the default settings, we can go back to the default settings here by simply clicking this button. You see, managing virtual machines on Hyper-V isn't a terribly difficult process, and now that you've seen all of the options that are associated with the hardware in our virtual machines and the Hyper-V management options, you should easily be able to start working with your own virtual machines. When you think about each virtual machine simply being a real machine, and you should treat it like a real machine in the majority of respects, managing it is not really all that much different from managing a real machine, with the obvious exception being that there's not a whole room full of servers. You could just have one server and many different virtual machines, and that means just one physical box to keep running. So in this video, you've seen how to add and remove hardware from a virtual machine. How hard disk works, we've seen how to add and remove them, memory, CPUs and network cards, as well as other options relating to how Hyper-V itself works. So we hope you've enjoyed this video and would like to thank you for watching.